Yeah, thanks everyone for being here. Um, so we've just finished the 2021 Pride Month, the month of June, which is the reason we wanted to put on this meeting and have this discussion today. And I always find Pride Month a little bit bittersweet because you get to see all the gains that we've made, and there's this kind of visibility of queer life that I think would just have been unimaginable at other points in history, quite recent history. Um, but Pride Month is also such a reminder of how far we still have to go in terms of actually beating back homophobia and transphobia, let alone winning full queer liberation. And, I did a quick search when I was writing my notes because I wanted to get the details about Samuel Luis in Spain, the gay nursing student who was murdered in a homophobic attack in Spain last week. I'm sure people have heard about it because it's been all over the news. But what was quite striking just searching for that information was how many articles popped up about other recent homophobic attacks. There was one in Jacksonville, Florida, Liverpool and Cardiff in England, Toronto in Canada, and Zagreb in Croatia. And it was like quite shocking how just how many other acts of violence in such a short period of time had taken place. And last month in The Guardian, they also reported that 2021 is already set to be the decade's deadliest year for trans and gender non-conforming people in the US. At least 28 trans people have been killed so far this year, and most of them were Black or Latinx trans women. But we know that this kind of violence runs deeper than just individual acts of violence. And while we've made great strides in terms of formal equality, particularly for gay people, and social attitudes have shifted significantly around, questions of same gender attraction, there's still gendered and sexual oppression enshrined in a lot of our laws. And I think the sharpest version that we see of that today is the institutional attacks on trans people. Taking the form of transphobic bathroom bills, the attacks on trans athletes, bans on gender affirming healthcare, particularly for children. And that now there are 33 states currently introducing 117 different anti-trans bills this year alone. And the Human Rights Campaign is calling 2021 the worst year for transphobic legislation since they began tracking it 15 years ago. So clearly there's never been a more important time for the Pride marches and the movements that can take up this kind of violence and oppression. But there's always a bit of a tension at Pride marches, right? There's this tension on the one hand between the mainstream marches that have, corporate sponsorship and rainbow police floats and a kind of more of a party, versus on the other hand, the political marches that highlight the battles that we've still got to win, and that point out who our enemies are. And those are the glittery corporations and bank floats and rainbow police floats in those parades. And over the last few years, we've seen the rise of these anti-corporate, anti-police, radical reclamations of Pride marches all over the world, from New York to London to Sydney and lots of other places. And in those marches, rather than seeing, like gay CEOs of corporations as a victory for the movement that we should celebrate, these radical Pride alternatives or blocks in the wider Pride marches argue that there should be no CEOs at all. And they often include demands to end detention of LGBTQ migrants, for universal healthcare that includes gender affirming medicine and medical care, and against Israel's attempts to use its kind of gay friendly tourism to distract from the occupation of Palestine. And the reason that it's called a reclamation or a reclaiming of Pride is because it's a return to the radical origins of Pride itself. Because originally Pride marches began as a commemoration of the Stonewall riot in 1969, the event that really spurred on the contemporary gay liberation movement. So the Stonewall was a bar in Greenwich Village in New York that was run by the mafia, and it was a regular site for police bribes and police raids. But it was one of the few places where working class and poor and middle class gay and trans people, particularly Black and Latinx queer people, and often sex workers, could gather and be themselves in some kind of safety. And on one night in June, the police raided the bar, as they often did, and quite spontaneously, the 100+ patrons, refused to have their IDs or their genitals checked like usual. This was the way that they checked if someone was cross-dressing at a bar, was to do a genital check and then jail them for it. And the crowd started throwing coins and then bottles at the cops, and the riots continued for several nights and really became this watershed moment, sparking these new discussions and organizations and a movement for queer liberation alongside and in conversation with other growing movements at the time against racism, against the Vietnam War, for women's liberation, and so on. And our comrades have written some really wonderful articles about the origins of Pride and the experience of trying to wrest it back from the banks and the cops. So I'm just going to drop those in the chat for people to take a look at in your own time. Now I just want to turn a little bit to the origins of sexism, homophobia, and transphobia, because we, as Marxists, as socialists, have a particular way of understanding how oppression emerges and how it operates. And we see these as, these as oppressive ideas and systems that capitalism uses to control our bodies and reproduction and families in order to keep the system running and to keep it profitable. So most other explanations see these oppressive ideas like sexism, homophobia, and transphobia just as ideas in people's heads. Some people are just backwards, or they fear what they don't know, or they're in a religion that has very strict ideas. But Marxists believe that the ideas in our heads are determined by the way society is organized, and the way we feed and house and clothe ourselves, the way that we reproduce ourselves as a society at different periods in history, that shapes the way that we think about the world and the way that we relate to other people. And the historical evidence that anthropologists and archaeologists have been able to gather tell us that for most of human history, we didn't have these institutionalized forms of gendered and sexual oppression. There were different roles assigned to men and women based on different biological attributes, but there wasn't a clear power differential between people of different genders. And the evidence also shows that there was a lot of fluidity in gender roles, including many examples of societies with more than two genders and of people moving in between different genders. And this started to change when class societies emerged. So as farming developed, men increasingly grew to control the agricultural production and the wealth associated with that. And the need for more children to work in the farms and the fields pushed women out of those public spaces and into privatized child rearing roles. And that's where we start to see the idea of the family emerge, and where gender roles start to become more rigid and fixed. And the family functions in different ways at different times. But starting in the 19th century, the ruling class made this very concerted effort to enforce the idea of a nuclear family, where dad is the breadwinner and mom is the housekeeper, and she does all of the free labor to get the kids ready to be workers. And to hold up that idea of the nuclear family as natural and as necessary, the ruling class has to police anything that doesn't fit into that model. So around this time, that meant, religious rulings against non-procreative sex and bans on abortion. This is the period when homosexuality as a term was first used, and when homophobic legislation began to appear, because they had to treat same-gender attraction as deviant and not normal, because it was a threat to that family, the family structure. And the family is also the first place in our lives that polices our genders, projecting a certain idea of who is a woman and who is a man, and what are the qualities that make up masculinity and femininity, and then punishing people who don't fit into those binary roles. And Marxists look at this history of how oppression emerged and developed and how it changes throughout class society, not as some academic exercise, but because it helps us to understand where oppression comes from. And understanding where homophobia and transphobia come from is the first step towards eradicating them. And this, I think, is actually one of the most inspiring things about Marxism, that oppression has a start point rooted in class society. That means that it can have an end point too. So in other words, if oppression is created and maintained to serve and maintain a particular class arrangement, this means that an end to class society actually creates the possibility for a complete end to oppression as well. But there's obviously nothing inevitable about this. Ending oppression depends entirely on what we do with Marxist ideas in the here and now. And unfortunately, there's a small but kind of vocal minority around the left today still, particularly in the DSA, in my experience, that I think have really missed the anti-oppression heart of Marxism, and who try to reduce questions of oppression down to sort of a crude and mechanical economic explanation. And their historical analysis isn't necessarily wrong. Like, they talk about how slavery is rooted in profit, and the way that immigration controls are rooted in controlling the flow of labor. They understand that the nuclear family polices gender and sexuality, in the way that I just explained. But these people, sometimes called economic determinists, they often come across as dismissing oppression in the here and now, kind of like, oh yeah, well, it's because of capitalism. We need to get rid of capitalism and you won't be oppressed anymore. And worse, some of these people say that taking up this or that specific anti-oppression demand or movement is divisive and fractious. And what we need instead is just universal class demands that are going to unite everybody. So for instance, the DSA chapter that I'm a part of has been having a big debate around racism. One side arguing we need to organize explicitly around Black issues, we need to develop Black leadership in the organization, and the other side saying, no, we should organize exclusively around class, poverty, unionization, and that's automatically going to improve the lives of Black people and bring Black activists into the group. And as you can imagine, the chapter has been losing a lot of Black members who are rightly pretty furious that the group isn't centering this kind of oppression, especially, in the context of a year of Black Lives Matter in the streets. And my cat just stepped on my keyboard, so I lost my place in my notes. So in my experience, I'm curious to hear from others as well, the debate about kind of class versus oppression comes up most often around questions of race and racism. But I think they have wider implications around homophobia and transphobia and just oppression in general. Because in response to what feels like a dismissal of oppression, groups and individuals that organize around specific forms of oppression, I think, can be quite skeptical of people they see as these economic determinists, and of Marxists in general, feeling like, what does Marxism offer me as a person experiencing transphobia or anti-Black racism or Islamophobia today? And I think it's such a tragic misunderstanding and misapplication of Marxism in this situation. It turns groups of oppressed people away from socialists and often towards other more limited theories of oppression, and to either to organizing strategies that don't work or to no organizing strategy at all. And just kind of like a very individual way of understanding oppression. And, in any case, there simply can't be a serious fight against capitalism unless it takes up questions of oppression too, explicitly, and not just as an afterthought or as something that's like secondary to real class struggle. Because the thing is, the working class is trans and is queer and Black and Muslim and disabled, and so on. And we can't build a genuine movement against capitalism, let alone a revolution, without a clear politics of solidarity with all oppressed groups. Before I wrap up, I just want to say a little bit more about the anti-oppression, the limitations of some anti-oppression politics on the left. This time, not so much among socialists, but among feminists. So as trans people have fought and become more visible over the last few years, there's been this backlash from the right. There's moral panic around children and the medical intervention of trans children, and a lot of hand-wringing about women using public bathrooms or changing rooms, like as if these Republicans have ever cared about what happens to women in bathrooms at any other time. They only care about it when they can do some bigoted legislation against trans people. But so we see all these arguments, transphobic arguments, reflected in the state legislation that I mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, the anti-trans backlash is not just confined to the right. There's a minority of feminists who are not only anti-trans, but they actually believe the movement for trans rights is a threat to the movement against women's oppression. And these people call themselves gender critical feminists, but they're known in the wider movement as TERFs, trans exclusionary radical feminists. And this is a particularly live discussion in Britain, but I think it's also felt in the US as well. And these feminists argue to exclude trans women from women-only spaces on the grounds that they aren't really women. And their argument is, when you drill down, rooted in really essentialist and biological determinist ideas about what constitutes a woman. And they say that biology is a material fact, and that they believe people assigned male at birth can't experience women's oppression because they haven't lived their entire lives as women, and they haven't suffered either the biological or social oppression that comes with being a woman. And this is a pretty weird contention, as if like a young trans girl experiences her enforced boyhood just like other boys and lives as a boy oppression free until one day she decides to become a girl. When the truth is, trans women suffer a complicated mix of both sexism and transphobia. And if you look at any of the data on the attacks, it's impossible to deny that trans women are some of the most oppressed and violently targeted people in our society. And even worse, some of these gender critical feminists argue that trans women are simply men in disguise, seeking to access women's spaces for nefarious and violent reasons, despite there being absolutely no evidence of trans people attacking cis women in public bathrooms or change rooms. And actually, the people getting attacked in bathrooms are trans people. There was actually a transphobic hoax recently in the neighborhood where I work in Los Angeles, where a right-wing anti-trans activist manufactured a fake video complaining about a naked Antifa man. It's very significant they said Antifa, in the sauna, traumatizing her children. And there were these protests and these pretty violent clashes outside of the spa because it's kind of known as a place that supports trans rights, has trans customers. And the video went all over the internet, but it was made up. Like there was no altercation. It was just someone who wanted to run a campaign against a trans affirming business. And I think we have to be clear here that the right is leading the transphobic charge, but this small number of feminists who are, debating trans existence, they're contributing to a transphobic environment. And I think that they're helping justify the violence that's meted out against trans people. Okay, just to wrap up, as I said at the start, Pride Month really, it reminds us of how far we've come in the fight for LGBTQ rights, but it also reminds us of how much there still is to win. And I think we really have our work cut out for us, exposing these transphobic bills for what they are, as well as taking on some of the limits of anti-oppression politics, both on the socialist left and in sections of the feminist movement. And, I think the memory of Stonewall is really important to recall here. Gay and trans people, many of them people of color, and their supporters knowing their enemy and standing shoulder to shoulder in a fight for a better world, for a world without oppression. And I think it's what we need today. So I'll leave it there.